Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. We've got a really interesting session this morning looking at housing from across Europe. I'm really pleased to say that we've been joined by Dirk van Gameren, who's going to give the talk today. Dirk is Professor of Housing Design and Dean of Faculty of Built Environment and Architecture at Delft University of Technology. And he's also partner at Meccanu Architects. He is one of the authors of Housing Atlas Europe, the 20th Century. And today he's going to give us a talk through a lot of the content of the work undertaken as part of the Atlas. For those that haven't seen the Atlas yet, it's got sort of nearly 100 schemes in there, and it's very much a sort of chronological take through some of the most significant housing developments across the continent. If you would like to buy a copy, I think as many of you will have seen in the email, you can get a 20% discount from Lund Humphreys, which they've offered until this Sunday. So once you've seen all the interesting stuff from Dirk, then you can buy a copy of the book too. We're really pleased to have Dirk with us, not only as sort of author of the book, but also as a sort of hugely knowledgeable person on housing design. Dirk's been engaged in housing design for over 25 years, both in designing schemes himself, but also more widely in research and publications on the topic. Alongside his work on the Housing Atlas at Meccanu and also at Delft University, he also leads a research network looking at the delivery of affordable housing in the global south, particularly Asia and Africa. And there's a sort of huge other topic as well, and sort of great interest in Dirk's work on that front. Without too much further ado, I will pass over to Dirk. Dirk's going to talk for about half an hour, and we'll then sort of have 15 minutes at the end for taking questions and a bit of discussion. So what we'd quite like to do is if you can all put questions in the chat, sort of as you think of them through the presentation, but we won't interrupt Dirk sort of mid-flow. We'll let him get all the way through the presentation, and then we'll have a really good discussion at the end. So over to you, Dirk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, for this introduction. And of course, thank you to the Urban Design Group for inviting me and to give me the opportunity to present and say a little bit about the Housing Atlas, Europe 20th Century, that was published recently, I think in a beautiful way by Lund Humphreys. I will now start sharing a presentation. And so the first slide that you see is the cover of the Housing Atlas. And that also gives me the opportunity to say that this is not only my work, but I worked on this for quite some time in an intense way with three colleagues, all experts in housing design. The project for the Atlas was initiated by Orsina Simone Pierini from Milan. And also we work together with Carmen Espegel from Madrid and Mark Swanerton, a compatriot, I think, of most of the viewers at this moment, based in London. So, as already mentioned by Jane in the introduction, the Atlas documents almost 100 projects, housing projects, designed but also realized, actually built and still existing. That was one of the criteria in our continent, in Europe. Of course, the choice can always be debated. And as you can imagine, we had some fierce debates among the authors which projects to include. So it's a kind of idiosyncratic choice of four people. But I do think that together they give really I think a very interesting and insightful panorama of how housing design developed in the 20th century. And our focus was really to document the projects on the different scales that are part of housing design. So it's about the housing typology, the housing units, how they were developed. But I think the main focus of the Atlas, that's also why we call it an Atlas, is really on the larger scale. how housing design in the end also creates an urban structure. So how housing design is connected immediately and cannot be separated from urban design. So that's why I think it's very exciting to talk for the urban design group, because I think housing design is in the end urban design. And yeah, we try to show that in the atlas by making drawings, and you see some fragments of them here on this slide, that actually show indeed how the clustering of housing and the connection to its context indeed creates an urban structure, an urban context. And I always like then to quote Berlage, the famous Dutch architect and urban designer from 100 years ago. Our cities are formed by housing. That is, let's say, what makes our cities. And that's also, I think, what the Housing Atlas wants to show. And I want to give you a few examples by means of a small selection of projects documented in the Atlas, how indeed had this connection developed over time. And I start with a project that is in one of the essays, but definitely not in the Atlas, because that's about the 20th century. But for me, this is one of the most fascinating housing projects and urban design projects in the history of housing. And of course, you are familiar with that. It's the Adelphi project in London. That is still, and I will come back to that in a few moments, an inspiration for architects during the full 20th century. And I think that's also one of the things we want to show in the Atlas, that ideas are developed over time, but there's not, let's say, one clear evolution. Ideas come back, traditions come back, and innovations are sometimes based on going back to history and not, let's say, radically, abolishing the idea that history plays a role in design. On the contrary. Of course, the interesting thing of the Adelphi is that in turn, it was also based on history. It was inspired by the visit of one of the Adam brothers to the palace of Diocletian in Split, or Spoleto, that at that time was already slowly transforming in a city. You could say again here, a building is identical to urban design. This is a plan that we've drawn at our school here in Delft, showing in black the original structure of the palace, and in a brown color, everything that was added, turning a palace into a city, into a residential environment. And I think that's a very interesting idea about housing design, that it's more than just a large number of housing, but together it also can give shape to a larger and maybe unified structure. And this is, to go quickly through it, a plan of that quite amazing, let's say, urban structure created in the Adelphi project. Sadly, only small fragments have been left. The central block here still on an image of the early 20th century is gone. But you can still go in the undercroft, in the underbelly of the project with these fascinating underground roads. But this idea that housing is indeed not just a repetition of a certain type or unit, but that it can create indeed, let's say, an urban structure and urban spaces, I think can be very well illustrated by one of the first projects that is documented in the book in Amsterdam, the so-called Zaanhof project in the Spaandammer buurt. And here you see an aerial image of the Spaandammer buurt, a typical working class neighborhood of Amsterdam that started to be developed at the end of the 19th century. In the usual way, our cities in the Netherlands were being built. There was no design, you could say. The original land parcellation, the parcellation of the open land, the typical Dutch polder landscape of canals and ditches, was simply transformed into an urban area by covering the ditches, turning them into roads, and then building up the space in between the original ditches into closed building blocks, leading to very narrow and often very awkwardly shaped building blocks that lacked a lot of quality in terms of daylight, ventilation in the internal courtyards. So at the beginning of the 20th century, this started to change because then, let's say, the urban layout became also a design issue. And you can see that in this drawing that you can also find in the atlas, where in light gray, you still see, let's say, this old way of building a residential neighborhood following the land patterns. You can see it on the left, you can still see in a parallel way the pattern of canals and ditches. But then in that first quarter of the 20th century, now 1910, architects stepped in and they drastically changed that original layout into larger, very irregularly shaped building blocks that created open spaces for the first time. Large central courtyards, green collective spaces inside the blocks, and larger public green spaces surrounded by these blocks, super blocks, with an inner and an outer ring. And the Zaanhof is a beautiful example of that. It's quite famous because of this building. And if we talk about palaces, the palace of Diocletian, this was also considered to be a palace for the working class, the famous project Het Schip, designed by de Klerk. And de Klerk, some projects of him can also be found in the Housing Atlas, really in this beautiful expressionist brick architecture, found a new way of designing housing, but also making it part of this new idea of creating a generous urban structure for a working class neighborhood. And the idea was to create courtyards. And in the block of de Klerk, there's this beautiful small courtyard. But the Zaanhof project, which is in detail documented in the atlas, shows how this larger block with an inner and outer ring creates a whole succession of spaces, a layering of public, collective and private spaces. Here you can see an old image that's also in the atlas of this inner ring with a very interesting also development of housing typologies, but I'm not going into that now, having limited time to speak. And then this fantastic open space in between, which for that time was really a major invention or innovation. A project, to be honest, one of my favorites in the atlas, that takes this idea a step further is in Vienna in that period of the 1920s, where the famous Heuven, the super blocks in the socialist period in the history, the checkered history of Vienna were being realized. And this is a drawing of the Rabenhof, one of these Gemeindebauten, as they're called in German, where you can also see how in a very interesting way the existing fabric of the city of the densely built closed perimeter blocks of the 19th century Vienna, but even some more rural remains of village parcellations, you can see them on top of the drawing, how they, let's say, triggered a design that was completely new, creating a succession again of courtyards and streets, but that carefully connects to that existing fabric. Here an image of the project and a drawing, which you can also find fragments of in the atlas, showing how the new buildings, it's not only about housing, but also about a lot of collective amenities, how this carefully connects to the existing surrounding structure. So not creating an isolated enclave, which often happens with large-scale housing projects, and you can find those as well in the atlas, but here really making it part of the city. And that was I think, a major step in the development of housing design connected to urban design. Interestingly, if you look in the housing typology, that is also documented of every project in the Atlas, you see that there is no invention at all, and these very complex shapes of the project, in the end, everything is filled with one standard of a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment accessed by a vertical stair system. Another image of one of these collective courtyards. Well, I go, of course, in a very fast, in high speed through the 20th century. Of course, ideas changed. The famous CIAM conference about rational ways of building, introducing a complete new way of thinking about how to create a city with housing. The famous diagram of Walter Gropius made for this publication. And of course, the projects that were a result of this major change in thinking, also documented in the Atlas, and we could not avoid the unité d'habitation, but we tried also to include in our Atlas unknown projects. So it's partly the familiar, but it's also substantially a book that I hope that you readers will discover projects you didn't know before, but are also, I think, for today still inspiring. If I go to one of my predecessors here in Delft, Jaap Bakema, I think the most influential urban and housing designer in the 1950s and 60s in the Netherlands. Interestingly, although as a member of Team 10 and really into this kind of radical modernism, he also went back to these older inspirations. And as an editor of Forum, the famous Dutch magazine where Aldo van Eyck and Herman Hetsberger contributed to, he dedicated the whole issue to the Palace of Diocletian in Spoleto, in Split, that I also showed at the very beginning. And he was very intrigued, not so much by the palatial classical architecture that inspired the Adam brothers, but by this idea of growth and change over time. And that a city, let's say a collection of housing and other functions could also be considered as one unity, as a palace, living in a palace. That was his ideal. He made Bakema many statements about this, that all the housing of the people together would be the palace of the future. That was one of his favorite statements. And he saw that in this example. And he made sketches and photos. And he was very much intrigued by that idea of the wall, the perimeter wall of the palace that had become a kind of structure that had been able to change and adapt itself over time. And he tried to recreate that, although you could say in a very abstract way, in one of his best-known housing projects, documented in the Atlas, of course, where he proposed clusters of housing with a variety of types, really trying to not to work with one type, but really almost imitating the development over time by bringing together 14 very different housing types, bound together by a wall-like structure at the edge. And he also introduced that idea of growth and change over time that fascinated him so much in the Split project. So one of the types that he developed for this project, a hall in Eindhoven, in the southeast of the Netherlands, is the so-called growing house, where a basic structure, and you see some sketches on this page, would allow the inhabitants to change and increase the size of their house over time. This was the result, as documented in the Atlas. So you see on the top side the wall-like structure that makes a border to the open landscape north of the project, and then behind that, protected by the wall, this whole variety of low-rise housing. And this is, of course, also a moment in housing and urban design, where low and high rise are being combined into one project. And this is one of the more detailed drawings you can find in the atlas, where we show the different types and how they work together. Now, these ideas, you could say, come also back in one of my other favorite projects that's in the atlas. It's the Barbican, and this, of course, in London, a model of an earlier design phase, but more or less showing the structure that was actually realized. And what's so interesting, that if you read the first publication where the architects, Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond, presented their project, they showed again the Adelphi. You can see it on the left side in a diagrammatic drawing. But they also showed the idea of the ideal city of Leonardo da Vinci. So for this project that, is of course now the icon of brutalism, has roots in history. And you could even, I think, make that comparison with the Rabenhof, because it's a kind of large meandering structure, creating new spaces, courtyards, and streets within like a kind of continuous built structure. This is a drawing showing the second level, the podium level. This is, of course, one of the most complicated projects to document, because it's very big, it's very complex. And also, if you talk about housing types, well, like at Hall of Bakema, this is an incredible catalogue of all possible housing types. We had to make a selection here for the atlas. This is one of the original drawings. Well, you know the image. But of course, what happened here, unlike the Rabenhof, which is really connected to the context, you could say this is really an enclave where the connections with the surroundings have always been considered, or are maybe still considered, as rather problematic. And I think, and I hope with my other authors, that this is something that people can really take out of our publication, to make these comparisons, to see the similarities and the differences. And from that, I think you can learn and be inspired if you start, especially geared, of course, towards students and practitioners, if you start working on your own project and design tasks. And I think especially in this comparison that you can do crisscross over the atlas, not per se in a chronological way, I think gives you a lot of information and ideas. And I want to conclude with a project that is not in the atlas because it was finished in 2006. So it's outside of the scope of the book. Maybe the next edition could include this. It's a project, I've been one of the architects working on this in Amsterdam. It's called Funenpark. And you see here a lot of ideas that come very clearly forward in the housing atlas brought together. So you could read this project, and this is an aerial view, as a super block with a wall-like structure that gives a very clear, let's say, edge to the project towards the public space, the street here, street and the railway here. But inside, you see this more modernist approach of freestanding buildings in a green, continuous space. So it's really bringing together different concepts that have been developed over time. And here you can see a drawing, a kind of a nollie plan showing in white what is publicly accessible, the entrance halls, commercial spaces, passages that go through the individual buildings. And we worked on this for quite some years with a group of architects. The master planner is Frits van Dongen. I was able to design some of the residential buildings. And a lot of precedents came by when we had this discussion. And you can find these precedents in the Housing Atlas. And it shows how important it is, at least for me, to know these projects, to study them so that you can use them as references. Obviously, the idea of a protective wall with a smaller scale, soft inside, Biker wall, Newcastle, Ralph Erskine, We discussed that as an example. These are drawings from the atlas. The individual buildings, let's say, in that inner space, I think clearly relate to the example, which was really an eye-opener for me as a student at that time, of the Rauchstrasse in Berlin, the IBA project, coordinated by Krier, where the urban villa was, well, let's say, reinvented as a type for urban housing. But also, the idea for the project in Amsterdam that the individual units should as much as possible be directly connected to the open space comes from very earlier examples, like the famous block in Spangen by Brinkmann in Rotterdam, which of course is also in the atlas. Well, this is one of the buildings that I've been able to design for this project, and this really tried indeed to bring a lot of ideas from the 20th century together in a project that is considered in the city, if I may say so, as quite successful as a whole, because it combines all these different ideas in a very varied but also clear new concept for urban housing. And for example, this idea of a direct access of the individual units to open space, like you can see here on the roof of the project, is clearly inspired by this famous image, one of, I think, the nicest images in the atlas, of the invention of the access deck on an upper level, a street in the air. That's another idea that comes back again and again in the housing atlas. Well, I could go on talking for a long time, but I want to stop here. And I hope I've been able to give you an idea about the content of the atlas, but also I wanted to make clear that I really see this as a source of reference and inspiration for the big challenge we face today as architects and urban designers, to address the ever-existing housing crisis and the need for good housing in our cities. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. That's a really brilliant kind of window into the work and all that you put together in the atlas. That's amazing. Any questions that you'd like to put to Dirk, or sort of topics you'd like to hear him expand on? I mean, I think sort of while people sort of think through their questions, I think sort of one of those messages that comes through really clearly is this sort of the threads that are taken through from sort of earlier schemes, and this sense of innovation always learning from the past, and that it isn't sort of entirely sort of innovation for innovation's sake. I mean, I suppose one of those sort of messages in that is sort of through that chronology of them, is that sort of departure from context and then coming back to sort of recognizing context. I suppose of the schemes within the atlas, I suppose which of those do you think sort of were most significant in sort of marking that sort of return to considering context much more significantly?
That's a good question. Of course, the easy answer is, well, read the atlas. But I think you see this turn. Sometimes people think it has to do with postmodernism, this return to the past. But I think that's not true. You can see, especially in the last 20 years of the atlas. Also, if I may mention another Dutch example, it's the redevelopment of the Eastern Harbor District. It's also documented in the atlas, the so-called Borneo Sporenburg scheme, which was hailed really as an innovation in urban and housing design. But in fact, it goes back to the traditions of the city of high-density, low-rise housing with individual townhouses alongside narrow streets in a grid-like pattern. But it did come back because in earlier phases, project for the redevelopment of this part of Amsterdam, the designs were still like very modernistic, because postmodernism somehow escaped the Netherlands for a long time. So it was still the idea of building freestanding slabs, apartment buildings on these narrow strips of land. But this was really an eye-opener, to go back to these more traditional urban structures, but then also at the same time seen as very innovative. I find that very fascinating, that these things can work together.
No, definitely. I think that comes through really strongly, and it's a sort of fascinating phenomenon of the way that we develop and think. So we've got a few questions coming through. Tanya's asking, is there any way that this research, the sort of work you've done as part of the Atlas, can inform development in rural areas? I mean, you mentioned a bit of sort of some of the schemes where perhaps they'd sort of taken layers from both the urban and rural context. But I suppose in terms of people using the Atlas and the degree to be able to sort of interpret into rural schemes, what do you think?
Oh, that's a very nice question. And if you look at the Atlas, you can even see that we included some, you could say, more rural projects. And yeah, maybe indeed it doesn't make sense anymore to make this distinction. Of course, if you look at, let's say, housing production or housing development, residential development in a more rural context, what is the way to do it? Is that in a very, let's say, low density, endless spreading out, or should you try to have a kind of concentration, let's say, points of low rise, high density, so that you can still preserve the quality of the presence, the near presence of the open landscape? Because I think that should be the quality of living in a more rural condition. And I think the Atlas shows beautiful examples for that. A very famous one is, of course, Siedlung Halle in near Bern, which is in a wooded area surrounded by nature, but a very, let's say, a closely knit project of beautiful houses with a lot of privacy, but still very dense. So, and there are more examples like that in the book. So, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Doe. That's a great suggestion. Right. Robert asks, I suppose sort of thinking in the sort of sense on the sort of issue of density, do you have any thoughts on the best metrics to use when perhaps making that comparison between different types of housing? So is it, about dwellings per hectare, house rooms per hectare? Is it floor area ratio? Where, I suppose given the Atlas is so strong on the ability to make the comparison between, do you sort of have thoughts, I suppose, on the metrics that might be used alongside that?
Yeah, another good question, and not so easy to answer. So what is the best way also indeed to look at density? I often have the discussion here at the faculty. Do you look at, FSI? I think that's sometimes quite problematic. Do you look at density? That's very difficult, sometimes to compare that, because it really depends also on how you define the plot on which a certain project has been built. For example, if I may use that example again, the project in Amsterdam, the redevelopment of the Eastern Harbor District, at least for Dutch conditions, the density is very high. But if you calculate the water that's in between the strips of land, the density is not that high. So how do you calculate it? Density is a very difficult thing. But you could, of course, you can look at it at very different ways. We have a lot of discussion about it at the moment in the Netherlands. So, because the higher you go, okay, maybe you increase the density, but we also see that if you keep, now let me say it like that. There's a new development in Amsterdam going on with a big discussion where the city wanted to build towers of 100-meter high. And where architects who opposed that, they said that is not the character of Amsterdam. It's not a high-rise city. And they made projects where with 4 or 5 floors, they could reach the same density. And then it's really about, what quality do you put forward? Because with the towers, okay, there's a quality of the view because there's more distance between the built volumes. But with a 4 to 5 story high, very dense structure, you have the proximity to the street. And then it can also become a very subjective discussion, but I think it's a very important one. So it's not really an answer, but
no. Well, it's a big old topic of definitely. Okay. Other questions coming in. So, John Tricker asks, did the Dutch ABC planning system successfully help deliver low car developments in areas of high public transport?
oh, that's a very technical question. Can you repeat it?
So John's asking, did the Dutch ABC planning system successfully help deliver low car developments in areas of high public transport? John is a highways engineer, so that's why it's coming.
Yeah. Well, I think that hasn't always been successful. In the 90s, and we didn't include an example of that because they're maybe not the most inspiring projects, but in the Netherlands, we had this so-called VNEX program, which was centrally initiated by the government to create new residential extensions near the large cities, Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam. And they were mainly based on a relatively high density with low rise typologies and urban structures. And the idea was because they would be very close to the large cities with public transport connections, that it would reduce the amount of car traffic. But the opposite happened. It only increased car traffic because somehow people associate these more suburban low-rise developments with having your car in front of your house and preferably 2 cars. So it didn't work at all. But what you do see now happening, for example, in Amsterdam, with quite high developments close to really public transport nodes, that the best you can see this, let's say, on the rules, how many parking places to create, that we've been building parking facilities that are not used anymore. So things are getting better, but the idea that well-connected suburban developments will reduce car traffic, that was a dream that didn't come through. I've been myself working in London on the redevelopment of Thamesmead South, where I know that this was an important discussion, I think even stronger than in the Netherlands, about what parking ratios do you need, from 0 next to Abbey Wood railway station to a certain parking ratio on a further distance. I thought that very interesting, and I thought that you had much better, more advanced ideas on that than we have in the Netherlands.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, we probably don't feel we do.
No, that's why I say it.
It's good perspective.
No, but I'm serious. Yeah,
no, it's good.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think we've got one more question.
Okay.
So, Alistair asks, sort of says, really inspiring, asking, in your experience, do contemporary planning policies tend to constrain the sort of innovation in the residential design you've explored in the Atlas? Like, are there, I suppose, constraints to actually allowing this sort of ongoing innovation and things that are overly controlling things?
I think maybe not so much planning rules, but yeah, I think it's the financial situation, or let's say the housing market situation. What we see in the Netherlands, and I think you see it in many places in Europe and elsewhere, is that the demand for affordable housing creates at this moment to a production that is very much based on super minimal and very small residential units. I find that really problematic. I think maybe the only way we can try to address that at the moment is by at least designing housing in such a way that it can change over time, and that adaptation, combination of units is possible. Because it's also quite ironic. So in the 1990s, there was a big, there was a very clear strategy to rebuild, restructure post-war neighborhoods, because we thought all the housing from the 50s and 60s was too small. It was 50, 60 square meters. And that we had to replace that with a more mixed residential structure with larger units. But now, in practice, I see we build housing where the average unit is 40 square meters, so even smaller.
Definitely, yes. I think the housing crisis is definitely driving those flat sizes down
Yeah, so let's
significantly.
at least design in such a way that it can change over time. Otherwise, we again make a production that in 30 years' time we think what to do with it. Let's demolish it. And that's the worst thing we can do. We know that by now. Yeah.
Most definitely, indeed. So I think if anyone else has got another question, do shout. But I think sort of that has sort of covered quite a lot of what people were asking, and certainly I think that sort of has really inspired a lot of ongoing discussion, I'm sure. So
May I say one more thing?
yes, do Joe.
I
Yeah.
noticed that some of my fellow authors were also there. So they could also have gone into the discussion, but I really want to thank them for working together on this project.
No, certainly. And to all of you, I think, I mean, certainly from what I've seen of the Atlas, it really is a fantastic publication, and lots of the reviews online certainly endorse that. So thank you very much. So as I said at the outset, and as was indicated in the email, you can get 20% off the Housing Atlas book if you buy that before Sunday via the publishers. So you just use the link and the code within the email. Thank you again, Dirk. Really appreciate and giving us a kind of whistle stop tour. And I think many of us will want to really dive in and look at lots of the detail. And thanks to the other authors too, I think, because it's an amazing handbook. And I think the work that's gone in to redraw everything and have it at standard scales, and the ability to really compare across all the formats is fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dirk. And yes, we would love to have you back as well, and sort of to talk much more on your sort of wider research as well. It would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you to everyone that's joined.